So, good afternoon everyone and welcome to SMC. Thank you for joining us in today's forum entitled Canada Dreaming, Policies and Pathways in the Philippines-Canada Migration Corridor. So, Migration Conversations is a series of in-person and online events hosted by the Scalabrini Migration Center to discuss with partners and colleagues relevant issues and topics in migration. Today's event is also a part of the public engagements of the Link for Skills project, an ongoing research project of SMC examining labor shortages in the EU and how migration can be part of the strategies for addressing this challenge while also being mindful of the countries involved working towards fair labor exchange. The project is funded by the European Union under the Horizon Europe Research and Innovation Program. Canada is one of the countries involved in Link for Skills. Hello, I am Eunice Tejada, a research assistant of the SMC, and welcome to today's event. So just a few reminders before we start today's session that today's forum will be recorded and the recording will be publicly shared on SMC's Facebook page at a later date. So if you have concerns about the event being recorded, please approach any of the SMC staff at any time of the program. So to formally open our event this afternoon, may we welcome Dr. Marla Asis, Senior Researcher at SMC.
Hello, magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. A very good afternoon to everyone. And I'm very happy to welcome all of you to the Scalabrini Migration Center. I'd also like to welcome in a special way the team members of this project, Dr. Clarence Batan from the University of Santo Tomas, and Dr. Bryan, who came all the way from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada. She traveled 30 hours, but she's looking very fresh. She just came out of the plane. So, thank you so much for saying yes to our invitation. Actually, maybe this morning, Catherine just sent an email, considering that there was the passing on of our beloved Pope Francis yesterday. She was asking, is your office still open? Are we going ahead? Are we going ahead with the forum? And I had a big answer. Yes, we are all saddened by his passing, but also carry on. And it's also good to remember actually that in his last Easter message, last Sunday, in Urbe et Orbe, to the city and to the world, one of the themes that he took up in his message was really about migration. And we also have to remember that when he first, one of the first things that he did as a pope was also to visit the island of Lampedusa, where many migrants from Africa, they find their way to Europe. They risk taking the boat from Libya and other and took on very perilous journeys, and then trying to find their way in Europe, and also trying to find a welcoming destination country. So migration is very close to his heart, and in fact, in the dicastery for promoting human integral development, there is a specific section on migrants and refugees. And I think this is also a good way to honor him, what he meant to us, and also the mission that he had on earth when he still was with us. So, yes. Well, in today's forum, we are very happy that we have participants representing different sectors. So I'd like to acknowledge the first one who came from the International Organization for Migration. We also have participants from the Department of Migrant Workers, known as the Assistant Secretary Lev Alcantara, and also participants from the Commission of Filipinos Overseas. Please raise your hands, from CFO, because they're quite a team. And yes, we're very happy to have you here because as we know, here in the Philippines, the division of labor among the different migration agencies, it's that the Commission of Filipinos Overseas is the one that's mandated to address the concerns and to take care of the permanent settlers. And Canada, the Philippines-Canada migration corridor is quite interesting because, of course, traditionally, Canada is a settlement country. And Canada is one of the major countries of destination where CFO also carries out a lot of activities. So also we have participants from CSO, our CSO partners, from Center for Migrant Advocacy, from Migrant Forum in Asia, and am I forgetting someone else? And we also have someone from the private recruitment agency from Staff House, Mr. Mark Capistrano. Mark was also one of the persons that we interviewed in this project. I think all three of us interviewed Mark when we were conducting the data collection activities in 2023 and also in 2024. So we're really very happy that you could join us. I hope that I did not forget. Oh, also of course from the Philippine Migration Research Network and the academe from Dalhousie University, Professor Scalabrini, and also Dr. Georgie Digno from the University of the Philippines, as well as PMRN, and also the SMC as well, because Professor Digno is now the editor of the Asian and Pacific Migration Journal. And I hope you won't mind my saying so. We also have someone who has Canadian experience. She's an international student in Canada, and she's also here for break before I guess she goes back to Canada. So I think we are going to have a very good discussion. Frankly, when people started coming in, the three of us started to get nervous as well. But I think what's important to bear in mind is that this is going to be a conversation about this very important migration corridor, which also is undergoing a lot of major changes, particularly on the side of Canada. So it would be important and it would be significant to know what's going on, and especially because, like Catherine has been doing work on Filipino migration to Canada for a very long time now. So if I remember correctly, Kat, in your data collection for your PhD dissertation, she actually traced the family members of the workers that she interviewed in Canada. So I think I myself am also quite excited now, and I'm looking forward to a very good exchange and conversations with the rest of you. Again, thank you so much, and let's get the ball rolling, I guess. I also have to mention that actually the opening remarks should have been said by our director, Father Marie, but unfortunately, because of health reasons, he's not able to join us. I think we can start.
Thank you, Dr. Marla, for opening our program this afternoon. And I guess before we begin the presentations, we just have a very short video message from Dr. Pauline Barber, the principal investigator of the project.
Kia ora everybody from New Zealand. I'm Pauline Barber, and I'm sending my heartfelt regrets that I can't be with you today because I'm attending a family reunion in New Zealand. But I wanted to say, Maligayang Pagbati sa inyong lahat. Kumusta kayo? Greetings everyone to this wonderful workshop Marla has kindly organized for our research team to present our collaborative research findings. I'm going to leave it to the team to introduce the project, but I did want to send my regrets and wish everybody well. My heartfelt thanks to Marla and her Scalabrini team for their generous hosting of this workshop, and to Clarence and his research team for their creative research endeavours. Catherine and I could not have asked for better research partners. You all went the extra mile, and as we shall see today, the results are fantastic. Good luck everyone, and salamat po.
So before we proceed, we would also just like to acknowledge the presence of our colleagues from the Scalabrini, who is here with us this afternoon.
Hello.
Alright, so I guess it's also just in order for us to get to know a bit about our panel for today's forum. So firstly, we have Dr. Bryan, who is an anthropologist and associate professor at Dalhousie University School of Social Work. Her work focuses primarily on social reproduction, migration, and livelihoods through the lens of feminist political economy. More precisely, she draws on qualitative and ethnographic methods to explore the historic, transnational, and relational origins of migration pathways connecting precarious labor markets in rural Canada to the Philippines, Mexico, and Jamaica. Dr. Bryan teaches in the social work program, and she is cross-appointed to the Gender and Women's Studies program and the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology. Next, we also have on our panel Dr. Clarence M. Batan, who is a
Professor of Sociology,
former director of the Research Center for Culture, Education, and Social Issues from 2015 to 2016 at the University of Santo Tomas. Dr. Batan was instrumental in the reorganization of RCCESI, which led to the establishment of two multidisciplinary-based centers, namely Research Center for the Social Sciences and Education and the Research Center for Culture, Arts, and Humanities in 2017. His research interests are the sociology of childhood and youth, sociology of work and employment, sociology of Filipino Catholicism, Global South scholarship, and the qualitative and mixed methods. And last but not the least, we have Dr. Marla Asis, who is a sociologist with more than 30 years of research experience studying international migration and social transformation with special focus on the Asian region. Her research and publications explore the themes of gender, family, and migration, migration and development, and migration governance. She served as Director for Research and Publications for many years and as Director of the Scalabrini Migration Center, was editor of the Asian and Pacific Migration Journal, and is currently affiliated with the center as a senior researcher working on selected projects. Everyone, let us give a round of applause for the panel presentation. So I guess we will be starting with Dr. Marla's presentation.
Yes. Well, first of all, Catherine will provide a brief background about the project, about this collaborative transnational research project. And then after the brief introduction, we will begin with a presentation of Dr. Batan, because his presentation will be about Filipino imaginaries about Canada. And then that will be followed by my presentation on the policy landscapes in Canada and the Philippines, but actually the focus on the Philippines. And then the last presentation will be by Dr. Catherine Bryan. So, Kat, would you like to say a few things about the project?
So first of all, thank you so much for being here. I know it's very Canadian of me to start with an apology, but it's what I'm going to do. I got 2 hours of sleep last night, so I have over-prepared, and I may not be as quick as I might otherwise want to be. So please bear with me, and my apologies and my sleeplessness. So I first want to start by offering a land acknowledgement. Pauline and I live and work on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people in what is currently called Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. The project that we are presenting on today was funded by SSHRC, which is the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and we are exceedingly grateful for their contributions and support of the project. So this is the title of the project, Fast Food Migration, Canada's Temporary Workers at Home in the Philippines. And the project has, over the last several years, explored the increasingly sort of well-worn pathway connecting Filipino labor to Canada through the sort of lens of Tim Hortons. So we used Tim Hortons as a kind of entry point. So the work isn't exclusively focused on Tim Hortons, but that is kind of where we started. And we use it, again, as an entry point, into a broader discussion of the manifold, mutually constitutive, but uneven sort of resiliencies and agendas of both workers and human capital, all of which are sort of bound up in this system. So Tim Hortons, as many know, is an ostensibly Canadian coffee shop and quick service restaurant that increasingly connects Filipino labor not only to Canada but elsewhere in the world. Though often from the perspectives of these workers with the long-term objective of securing a kind of pathway to Canada. So even those workers who end up elsewhere, we anticipate are sort of thinking about Canada in the long term. And so our project sought to explore internationally mobile labor, particularly from the Philippines to Canadian labor markets, by elaborating the tensions that can exist between capital that is differently purposed and spatially scaled, and yet equally invested in the selling of the Tim Hortons commodity and brand. And so where this all becomes kind of revealed is when we think about the sort of multinational structuring and organization of Tim Hortons. We're also very much interested in highlighting the aspirations and experiences of those workers who are both in the Philippines and Canada, who are kind of caught in the middle a little bit of those dynamics. So before turning to our individual contributions, I wanted to sort of highlight several features of this particular migration corridor that oddly enough, sort of, especially for Canadians, sort of travels through Tim Hortons. Next slide, please. So this timeline, which nobody can see, as it turns out, because it's very, very lean. I don't know why I always imagine that this is going to be way more visible, but once it's on Facebook, it'll be more clear. You can also just look this up on the Tim Hortons website. So this is Tim Hortons. This is their sort of official timeline. So they started in 1964, and they've got this glorious Canadian sort of history and legacy. And then in 2017, they expand globally and they find their way to the Philippines. Next slide, please. So what are the sort of features of all of this that I want to highlight before we move on? So the first is, of course, Tim Hortons' global expansion, and more specifically for our purposes, its expansion into Filipino coffee markets. This is a project that was spearheaded by Restaurant Brands International, Tim Hortons' parent company, which falls under the auspices of 3G Capital, which is a Brazilian private equity firm. Despite its growing kind of international presence, or perhaps because of it, Tim Hortons, as I'm sure many of you have seen here, remains branded as distinctly Canadian, offering through its decor and coffee shops now located around the world a range of sort of Canadian cliches and kind of half-baked truths about inclusivity, welcome, and community. High ceilings and wooden tables invoke the sort of expansiveness and naturalness associated with Canada. Next slide. And yet, typically kind of located in business districts and frequented by young, upwardly mobile professionals, Tim Hortons in the Philippines tends to be classed rather differently than it is in Canada. And this kind of corresponds to RBI's vision of the brand as affluent yet affordable. So in the Philippines, this is further realized through the brand's association with the country's middle-class Bryan economy, a consequence, as you all know, of course, of the state's long-standing promotion of labor migration and subsequent practices of remittance sending and transnational social reproduction, wherein survival, but more accurately, amongst a subset of migrant families, particularly those with opportunities in Canada, upward mobility has been realized. And next slide, please. And so we can understand the arrival of the brand in Manila as representing a kind of homecoming, an offering that was new to the Philippines but well known to Filipinos with Canadian connections. So capitalizing on the effective sort of potency of idealized depictions of migrant family life, we see this perhaps most clearly articulated in in early promotional material, which often depicted scenes of transnational connectivity, ongoing family responsibility, and the immense joy of eventual reunification. So set against the backdrop of a Tim Hortons cafe, the lines between life in the Philippines and Canada blurred, and the sacrifices of migration were rewarded. Hidden from view, however, and perhaps of course, are a myriad of problematic logics and the very challenging realities that prompt migration and labor migration, more specifically from the Philippines to Canada in the first place. And so our shared work and project, Fast Foods Slow Migration, Canada's Temporary Workers at Home and in the Philippines, is an effort to better understand those dynamics and realities as they relate to Tim Hortons in particular, but also thinking more broadly. So the project is transnational in focus, method, and analysis. Methodologically, the project focuses on Tim Hortons as an embedded case study of a major global corporation that well kind of captures the multi-directional mobilities comprising the migration corridor between the Philippines and Canada. It incorporated international collaboration and capacity building. Our research team includes 4 migration specialists, the Dalhousie PI and myself, our 2 amazing Philippine collaborators, plus graduate students and RAs from both countries. And so that was more than a few minutes, and that is my way, and I will do my best not to do this again in such a long-winded fashion, but I will pass it along to Clarence, who will be presenting from the Philippines side of things.
Thank you. Magandang araw po sa ating lahat. Mapagpalang araw po sa lahat. Good afternoon. Mapagpalang araw. I am Clarence, Batan, a Filipino sociologist from the University of Santo Tomas. And with me are my hardworking research assistants. All are undergraduate sociology students working on several projects, including this collaborative project entitled Fast Food Slow Migration, Canada's Temporary Workers at Home in the Philippines, which I finally called as FFS. So this is a project convened by my professor at Dalhousie University, Pauline Barber, with Dr. Pat, and fellow social scientist, Filipino social scientist, Dr. Marla, the Asis, from this lovely Scalabrini Migration Center. So, salamat po SMC sa pagbibigay sa amin ng pagkakataong maging espasyo ang inyong tahanan para sa aming panaliksik. In UST, we are from the Department of Sociology, Faculty of Arts and Letters, and the Research Center for Social Sciences and Education. And for this presentation, I am very pleased to have been offered research assistance by my sociology students, and I acknowledge their help in producing this presentation. My role in the team is as a youth sociologist, where I explore Filipino-Canadian migration phenomenon along the socio-anthropological discourse in the lives of young Filipinos. So my interest in this project is exploring the concept of the migration corridor, or in Filipino, daanan lugtong sa pang-ibang bayan, as preliminary attempt to understand how young Filipinos over the past years negotiate and navigate the search for decent employment and livelihood and eventual migration in Canada. In the examination of this phenomenon, I am conscious of the ever-evolving migration-related policies in both countries, the Philippines and Canada, especially in the world and politics of the New World Order of Trump and the shifting political drama both in Canada and in the Philippines. For this brief presentation, I shall focus only in uncovering the conceptual root of migration corridor in relation to the very familiar coffee chain in Canada, Tim Hortons, which found its way to the Philippines starting in 2017. Thus, using relevant studies, a cafe experience survey, and e-narratives available online, this secondary analysis charts emerging local constructs that reflect nature, dynamics, and negotiated pathways of the Philippine-Canadian migration corridor. This interrogation uncovers the underlying social dynamics that constitute a dynamic route of migration corridor which appears to underscore the interlinking orientation of intense effort due to hard work with and or goal attainment, in this case, the Canadian dream. This conceptual root may be called perspiration-aspiration dynamic, which in Filipino may be translated as dinamiko ng pagpapawis sa mithiin, which I argue direct attention to the interlinking youth mobility employment issues and migration taking place along the negotiated nook and corner of migration corridors. Let me start with a personal confession that I was and still am a fan of Tim Hortons, fondly called Teens. Just like many Filipinos who have had the chance to visit and study in Canada, I have become part of the Canadian food subculture. I was a Government of Canada scholar, which allowed me to study at Dalhousie University from 2002 to 2010 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And to be honest, I have not been keen in studying Tim's contribution to migratory discourse, but when I start witnessing more and more young Filipinos slowly but surely serving as team members, as cashier, checker, server, baker, manager, etc., I know that Teens has evolved into a space for migratory experience, potent for further investigation. This becomes more apparent in 2017 when Teen was introduced to the Philippines, and it has grown into nearly 50 stores across the country, which is a fascinating globalization perspective, such as in the context of what you call as McDonaldization, Disneyization, or even Jollibeanization phenomena, but more interestingly, in the context of migration discourse. As Teens package as a coffee food chain carries with it the concept of Canada, okay, welcoming to Canada, as if transporting or translocating the experience of Canada, I believe there is more reason to explore what Teen means to young Filipinos that contribute to the entire Canadian migration experience. Recent migration statistics in the past decade from the Philippine Statistics Authority of migrant workers suggest overseas Filipino workers are relatively young and generally females. This statistic seems to reflect the social demographic space of young Filipinos, especially females, from caring to serving, who engage in service economy provided by teams both in Canada and now in the Philippines. Thus, teams appear to provide a corridor or pathway for a possibility of migration to or in Canada. In reviewing relevant literature for this presentation, I observed the bounty of sources when it comes to understanding the following themes in migration discourse. First is on migration aspirations and the challenges which documents varying factors negotiated by migrants, such as role of intergenerational dynamics, transnationalism, and the salience of the persisting migratory outcomes such as remittances in understanding the state of migration among Filipinos abroad. Of great interest in this presentation are relevant issues of youth mobility related to the phenomenon of marginalization and precarity, akin to stepwise international migration, linear migration, slow change in temporal horizons, and in my own research about Filipino standbys that seem to intersperse with the notion of migration in waiting. Here, my sociological interest is the examination of roles of time and space, the phenomenon of waithood where young people from various cultures experience a form of marginalization. I am fortunate to note that the conceptual discourse about migration has established literature on migration corridor, and I see my task is only to further interrogate empirically, similar to how Barber and Bryan examined this concept relative to Tim Hortons as a case in point. Correspondingly, the literature on Tim Hortons is steadily growing, particularly demonstrating how this coffee brand appeared to fuel salient discussion on how its underlying social, political, economic structures are positioned in the social change discourse of the ebbs and flows of the globalized world. Thus, the knowledge gap that I am interested to fill up is along the theoretical and conceptual level across what we can construe locally from the global south perspective, the constitution of migration corridor as a space of negotiation between agency and structure along the migration processes as a social field. My working research focus is reflected in the following research question. So first I asked, considering the emerging role of importance as a brand of Canadian identity, how does the phenomenon of migration corridor contribute to further understanding the underlying dynamics of youth unemployment mobilities among selected young Filipinos? Specifically, I inquired into what are the contemporary conceptual understanding of selected Filipinos in terms of Tim Hortons Canada, in relation of Tim Hortons and Canada, and migration to Canada. So what youth employment and mobility issues emerge from the analysis of selected social media posts and a film related to young Filipinos' Tim Hortons work experience? And also I asked, what conceptual root does the findings and insights from questions 1 and 2 constitute a deeper understanding of migration corridor that young Filipinos experience while journeying across the Filipino-Canadian migration processes? So etymologically, the closest contextual translation of corridor, or in our Filipino language, is the word daan, which means paths, roads, or where to pass or through. Pass by through. However, in our local language, in my view, it will make more sense to include the concept of dugtong, which means link to position the migration process that we negotiate in establishing the connection to the country of destination, and in this case, Canada. While Ibang Bayan means to travel to another country. Taken together, I propose that this may be the closest expression of migration corridor in our Filipino language, which simply directs attention to understanding of paths to migration such as what the corridors provide. Ang daan ng dugtong sa pang-ibang bayan. Thus, this working conceptual framework, in this conceptual framework, what constitutes the migration corridor in the context of young Filipino experience or pang-ibang bayan are the constructs of abroad as aspirational ideal and Canada as a country of destination, represented by Tim Hortons as a space for migration. This corridor facilitates provisions for aspired employment and livelihood best captured in the Filipino concept of hanap buhay, which means the search of life, which is another salient concept in understanding the value of this migratory experience. The conceptual conundrum that this paper presents intends to uncover what the migration corridor allows and how it is possible for the social reproduction of migration. This simple working preliminary conceptual frame guided this research. So methodologically, this descriptive paper utilized 3 data sources. First is the Tim Hortons Cafe Experience Survey, using convenient sampling of those who exited from teams and those who had a chance to visit teams from July to December 2024. Quantitative data were analyzed using Excel and SPSS, limited only to descriptive statistics such as means, frequencies, percentages, and when applicable, word counts and word clouds. The second set of data was from the social media platforms and 2 films on Philippine-Canada migration as secondary working data in understanding the teen stories of young Filipinos and the general migration processes. I call these online stories as e-narratives. E simply means electronic, as these data are publicly accessible online across 3 platforms: TikTok, YouTube, and Netflix. Both videos and audio text were analyzed using Excel to produce the systematic nature of this selected social media data, and we utilize what we call as the social media visual tool to identify the emerging themes relative to my inquiry of the concept of migration corridor. And these are the findings. The analysis of both primary and secondary data direct attention to the following observations. 1. The conceptual understanding of Tim Hortons as Canadian brand appears to have been well established from the perceptions of their selected surveys, respondents, and social media content creators. The degree of Canadianness, as illustrated by Tim Hortons, is highly apparent by the national symbols popularly attributed to Canada. For example, maple leaf, maple syrup, hockey, red collar, etc. Two, based on the current available data, while there are few narratives that account for using Teens Cafe in the Philippines as a space for orientation and recruitment to Canada, we observed, and I observed, the nonlinear and maybe conceptual disconnection of teams with Canadian migration. This is due to the seemingly general middle-class packaging of teens in the Philippines compared to the observed mass-based access of teens in Canada. Number three, nonetheless, survey, social media, and film data reveal a relatively positive concept of Canada as a migration country of destination. While work-related challenges inform most of the narratives, the Canadian dream, which is most aptly reconstructed as Maple Leaf Dreams in one of the films we evaluated, direct attention to the better work conditions and decent livelihood expected as sacrificial fruits of Canadian migration. Number four, interestingly, majority of the selected respondents from all data sources, surveys, social media, and film, are relatively young Filipinos. To a certain degree, this allowed me to uncover varied youth employment issues emerging from their narratives. The data from the social media were most revealing here. In trying to understand the concept of migration corridor among the content creators, some emerging sub-concepts of Canada and on-Canadian are on labor market integration, economic vulnerability, economic security, and the observed culture of understanding and learning experience of these young Filipinos while working at teens, work dynamics, and the observed difference of teens in the Philippines and Canada. Some general migration issues observed in the social media visual data are the following: language barriers, emotional labor market regulatory mechanism, and another interesting set of social media data about Tim Hortons reveal mostly positive employment experiences captured in sub-concepts: service, resiliency, and gratefulness, work adjustment, interview and onboarding processes, Tim Hortons employment ideation, and about the macro labor and employment issues. They identified overemployment, role multiplicity, customer service industry discrimination, service training challenges, customer service industry empowerment, these are the positive things, economic security, labor market accessibility. And so, to end these 7 insights allowed me to respond to the general question: how does the phenomenon of migration corridor contribute to further understanding the underlying social dynamics of youth employment mobilities among selected young Filipinos? So, in the first working paper I wrote for the project, some working questions that come to mind to further inquiry were the following: on the question of young Filipinos' quest for better life in Canada, on the Philippines gain as byproduct of this Canadian maple leaf dream, and on the inquiry about social inequality, which young people enter, wait, and move through migration corridor. I may not have direct responses to these questions, but what the current analysis about the underlying social dynamics of teens, direct attention to the conceptual conundrum, this paper discovered. This conceptual root is what I call aspiration dynamic, which in Filipino may be translated as dinamiko ng pagpapawis sa bitiin, which I argue direct attention to the interleading youth mobility and employment issues and migration taking place in the migration corridors. Allow me to articulate using a thematic data matrix using selected insights from film analysis. Going from the findings, the qualitative analysis of thematic loads lead me to uncover working concepts that run the Filipino youth employment mobility issues, reflecting 2 narrative tropes. One is about the general observed condition of young Filipinos negotiating their employment experiences in a migration corridor that appear to revolve around the challenges and struggles. This is overcome by gratitude and hard-earned work, which I argue can be metaphorically and aptly represented by the concept perspiration. This alludes to the symbolic value of sweat or pawis, representing hard work and effort. When viewed from a perspective of earning a living or hanap buhay, the process of perspiration, pagpapawis, then becomes constitutive of one's struggles and hardship. The other narrative trope reflects hope, strength, and to a certain degree resilience among the observed young Filipino migrants working at teams. I argue that in the local context, the concept of mithiing aspiration aptly captures this disposition. Taken together, the perspiration-aspiration dynamic appears to run through the Canadian migration corridor's time and space. A closer analysis of the film Maple Leaf Dream clearly captured this youth employment mobility dynamic as seen in selected thematic codes and film strips. While hardship and struggles come in various forms, perspiration or pagpapawis, symbolically and literally as portrayed in the film, the aspiration of Canada appears to be enough to warrant acquisition of decent and secured livelihood. Here, migration corridor can be viewed as a negotiated space that allows time to adjust, recover, reconstitute, to reskill. And replan about the futures abroad as migrants in this film, at first, with permanent resident status and with a larger dream of becoming Canadian citizens. So in conclusion, conceptually, this paper uncovered an important gradient along the notion of migration corridor, ang daanan dugtong sa pag-ibang bayan in the context of the migratory experience of young Filipinos engaged with the Canadianness of Tim Hortons as a phenomenon. TEAM seems to provide a negotiated transnational space between Canada and the Philippines to render varied experiences of employment for the opportunity we call hanap buhay in this young Filipino search for a decent means of livelihood. What perpetuates or energizes this migration corridor provided by teams is what I call the perspiration, aspiration dynamic, encompassing the merit-bearing issues and concerns that Philippine-Canada migration processes provide. Thank you, and I hope this working idea I provided will merit attention for an in-depth discussion later. Thank you so much. Now I'll call Dr. Marla for her paper. Thank you.
Maraming salamat, Clarence. And now I turn to my boring presentation. Boring because I think, well, actually the task that is assigned to us in this particular project is to examine the policy context and the policy environment here in the Philippines. And so, but before I begin my presentation, I'd also just like to begin by thanking Pauline for involving the Scalabrini Migration Center in this particular project. And it was really a joy to work with the team. It's been fun and also a lot of learning, I think, for both parties. So thanks very much, Kat and Clarence, and of course to Pauline, who even if she's not here with us, is very much with us in terms of spirit. We feel her encouragement here if she's in New Zealand. So let me begin by also acknowledging that actually in the broader scheme of things, the broader scheme of Philippines-Canada relations, the formal start of which started 75 years ago, that migration played a very important role in cementing the relations between the Philippines and Canada. And at both ends of the corridor, migration has been acknowledged as something that's very significant. So, for example, if we take the case of the Philippines from the perspective of the Philippines, Canada is an important destination country, and from the perspective of Canada, the Philippines is an important source country of immigrants, and in recent decades, a very important source country for temporary migrant workers in Canada. The paper was written with Karen and Liao, but because Karen is also unable to be with us today, I'm going to do the presentation for both of us. And what we focused on in this paper revolved around two major questions. The first one is really to examine how the Philippines' well-established migration governance framework shaped its engagement with Canada. And I think this is an important point to make, considering that there have been major changes, fundamental changes in how Canada has approached the issue of migration. And the second part of the paper is almost similar to what Clarence and his team did, because what we also wanted to examine is that, of course, there's a set and well-established migration infrastructure and migration framework here in the Philippines. So how do aspiring migrants, especially those that are aspiring to reach their dream destination, which is Canada, how do they navigate not only Canada's migration requirements, but from the very outset, how do they also navigate our own migration infrastructure here in the Philippines? So how does, therefore, the institutional and policy context in the Philippines also serve as factors that facilitate as well as constrain their migration aspirations? And for the most part, in terms of data and methodology, we carried out analysis of the literature, analysis of migration data, and interestingly, while we focus also on data coming from the Philippines, when there is a lack of data, when there are data gaps, we also turn to statistics and data from Canada, which we find is very useful. So somehow the data gaps that we have here have been, to some extent, they have been compensated by the availability of relevant statistics in Canada. We also attempted to carry out some kind of a documents analysis, because what was also apparent is that there's a lot of information that's available on social media and online platforms. And so we attempted to we also did a short analysis for the periods from 2023 to around 2024 and 2025 of what are the reports that have been published concerning migration in Canada, and what have been the experiences of aspiring Filipino migrants, as well as Filipino migrants who are already in Canada. What do these news reports and also some of the selected social and media and online platforms say about leaving the country as well as settling in Canada? Okay. So, next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, migration is a key factor in Philippines-Canada relations. And as of 2022, of the 10.8 million overseas Filipinos, there were 879,301 Filipinos in Canada. This is data on the Philippines side of things. And Canada, therefore, is the fourth major destination country of the Filipino diaspora. And since the 2000s, it also emerged as a new destination for overseas employment. Okay? And that has a lot to do with the very significant trend in Canada in turning towards temporary migration. So for Canada, the Philippines is also a major source country of immigrants. So close to a million Filipinos have resettled in Canada. And what is also important to recognize here is the role of temporary migration from the 2000s. We will see some data concerning this a little later. But even in the census data of Canada in 2021, what the census data in Canada shows is that more than 30%, I think it's about 35% of Canadians of Filipino heritage. According to them, according to the data, they've only been in Canada in the last 10 years. So this also tells us about the recency of settlement in Canada. 35%, that's quite a big chunk. What we also have to remember from the very outset is that Canada is really a settlement country. In fact, if we look at migration literature, maybe in the 1970s and in the 1980s, you would always find references to 4 traditional settlement countries. And these are the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Why are they considered as traditional settlement countries? Because these are the countries that have policies of permanent resettlement. Okay? These are countries that have policies of permanent resettlement. Okay? So, and so even if Canada is a preferred and a desired destination of many Filipinos, but because the main pathway to Canada is through permanent settlement, which is not easy to achieve, which is not easy to achieve in terms of meeting the requirements, not many Filipinos make it to Canada. Right? So, but if we look at the data coming from the Commission on Filipinos Overseas, if I remember correctly, because I don't have all the numbers here, but Canada is actually the second destination country for permanent settlers. Of course, the number one is the United States. But in relation to the US is really out there as the forerunner. I mean, the gap between the US and Canada is quite wide. But nonetheless, in the hierarchy of Filipino migration aspirations, Canada ranks very high, ranking next to the US as the preferred or desired destination. So let's go to this. This is really a very summary presentation because a large part of the paper actually covers the institutional development of the temporary migration framework here in the Philippines. But since I know that the audience is very familiar with this part, I thought that I would just point out some main points. Okay? So what's important to remember is that, of course, when we speak of the Filipino diaspora and the distribution of Filipinos throughout the various regions of the world, the main factor that has led to this state of things is really temporary labor migration. Okay? Because if we had only depended on permanent settlement, then the distribution of Filipinos globally won't be this extensive. Okay? So we always go back, of course, to the 1974 Labor Code of the Philippines as the foundational document that set in motion overseas employment from the Philippines. Okay? And while the Philippines has been considered as a broker state by some scholars, and also this notion that the Philippine state has been in the business of brokering overseas employment for its nationals. If we actually look at the documents starting from the 1974 Labor Code, right from the very beginning, there was already quite a big deal of attention that was given to the promotion and the protection of migrants' rights, of the rights of overseas Filipino workers. Although at that time, that was not yet the language. Because remember, we started out, when it comes to the language and vocabulary of migration, we started out with OCWs. And then later on, we moved into this vocabulary of overseas Filipino workers. But yes, so, and what had happened from the 1974 Labor Code of the Philippines, of course, laws were enacted. But as you would notice, the laws that were enacted from the 1990s, beginning with the Republic Act 8042, and then the repeal of sections 29 and 30 of RA 8042, which is Republic Act 9422, and then Republic Act 122, and eventually Republic Act 11641, which created the Department of Migrant Workers. All of these laws were progressively aimed at enhancing the protection of overseas Filipino workers. Okay? So at least if you look at the documents, if you look at the, if we carry out the documents analysis, the protection of overseas Filipino workers has been emphasized from the very beginning, but it was intensified by the 1990s because by the 1990s, there was also the greater participation of women in labor migration. And there was a lot of concern about female migration, which became a lot more visible from the 1990s because of their concentration in domestic work. And for a time, the large numbers of Filipino women who were recruited to work in Japan's entertainment sector. So Remember, RA 8042, the Migrant Workers and Overseas Filipinos Act of 1995, which is a landmark legislation, particularly within the Asian region, in terms of having as the intent, the protection of migrant workers. That landmark legislation was enacted because of the triggering factor at the time, the execution of Flor Contemplacion, which many Filipinos believe happened, a tragedy that happened because of what was perceived as the indifference of the government. Okay, so it is towards protection. If we look at the development of the laws related to migration, the protection is a big part of it. So therefore, at this point in time, we considered RA 11641 as the most recent legal development. We are already at a point where the institutions, the legal framework, as well as programs and services concerning the protection of migrant workers have already been well established. And so, even when there was a major shift in RA 11641, a major shift in terms of the structure of how labor migration governance is to be implemented in the Philippines, because we started from a multi-agency framework, and then with the creation of the Department of Migrant Workers in RA 11641, which was signed into law in December of 2021 and was established in 2022. It was a major shift, but that particular shift did not really unsettle what has already been established in terms of the framework of how we are to approach the protection of migrant workers at all three key stages: before they leave the country, when they are overseas, and upon their return and hopefully their integration to the Philippines. So just very briefly, if I might show, but I will not go into the details. This is our framework, that there are programs, there are services that are available before migration, while overseas, and upon their return to the Philippines. And the one thing that has made a difference is that most of these programs and services now are available and are being implemented by the Department of Migrant Workers. Whereas in the past, some of these programs or some of these offices were under the Department of Foreign Affairs, or the social welfare attaches under the Department of Social Welfare and Development. But now all of these migration-related functions are housed under one roof, and that is the Department of Migrant Workers. So So when we look at Canada, the changes in Canada, as I mentioned earlier, have been really quite fundamental, because as you recall, Canada was and also still continues to be a settlement country, a settlement society. But from around the 1990s, there was a shift towards temporary migration. So it started with a temporary foreign worker program in the 1990s. And this particular program, according to some analysis, had also undergone three major changes. So there was the establishment in the 1990s, there was the expansion from 2000 to 2009, and again in 2010 to 2019, so that was just before the pandemic, there were also changes and modifications that have been made to the temporary foreign worker program. But then in addition to that, another pathway for temporary migration, another pathway to temporary migration in Canada is the International Mobility Program, which started in 2014. Ang kaibahan, the difference between the temporary foreign worker program and the International Mobility Program is that the former is really focused on addressing labor shortages in certain sectors in Canada. But what is also important to remember in the temporary foreign worker program is that employers and companies in Canada must show that they have tried to hire local workers, but they couldn't find local workers, and so they have to resort to foreign workers. So they have to undergo a process, and that's called the labor market, labor market impact assessment. Okay? So I was very happy to know that this particular concept was also mentioned in the film Hello Love Again. May Lamia, there were references to Lamia, so I thought, siguro one of the consultants must be ASEC led. So may Lamia, there was mention of Lamia, yes. So the difference between the temporary foreign worker program and the international mobility program is that the second one, the international mobility program, does not require Lamia. And also in terms of objectives, it's supposed also to address and to also meet social and cultural objectives in Canada. And then there's the student migration, which was also mentioned, in Clarence's presentation earlier. Okay? Estudyante muna, but actually there's also the intent to remain in Canada and to work in Canada. So it's really using another pathway to enter Canada, but actually with the intent of also finding work in Canada. What is also very important to remember about the temporary migration programs in Canada, the various temporary migration schemes, is that Canada offers a pathway for residents. Okay? So, and that is also a major draw for other overseas Filipino workers who are already abroad and who are also thinking of not necessarily returning to the Philippines for good, but remigrating to other destinations. The possibility that, unlike other destinations in Asia and in the Gulf region, there's the possibility and the pathway for residents in Canada. Okay? So, but what's also important to remember about Canada as a destination country is that unlike in the Philippines, we don't really calibrate our migration policies here. Our migration policies are, in the past 50 years, it's like, okay, so we try to support and to facilitate labor migration. And then the direction is also towards improving the protection of workers. But we don't really say, oh, okay, because of public clamor, then let's reduce labor migration. That doesn't happen and hasn't happened in the Philippines yet. But in Canada, immigration is a political issue. It is an election issue, and it can, it can influence the fate of an administration. So under the Trudeau government, there was this idea that immigration in Canada was really at such high levels. So much so that in 2024, they had to recalibrate their immigration level plans. And not only their immigration level plans, but also their plans for temporary residents. And I'll briefly show that to you. Okay. The other one. Okay. Yes. So here you can see that for 2025, 2026, and 2027, the intake of students temporary under the temporary migration program is under 400,000. Can you imagine in 2023, Canada admitted 1 million international students. So this is a big reduction in terms of numbers because of various debates in Canada about what runaway immigration levels mean, and especially because also of very concrete issues like the housing problem, which to some extent has been associated with the intake of many international migrants, including students. But what I'd like to show you is the earlier table. Yes. So this table is interesting because it summarizes the shift. If you look at the column of permanent residents versus the column for temporary residents, we can see that 2020 was the turnaround period. Because up until 2020, there were more permanent residents coming in compared with temporary residents combined. The workers, under the international mobility programs, and the students. And as you can see, for the 8-year period, there was a drop of 47% in terms of permanent residents, and look at that, 263% increase in terms of temporary residents to Canada. Okay? So let me just go to slides because Bernard is asking me to wrap up. But what we can see, I just have a few things to say about some of the key findings. Is that actually in terms of managing migration in the Philippines, our well-established framework has served as well. Okay? And it has also helped us in negotiating with Canada, even in relation to temporary labor migration. Okay? It's interesting to see that during the expansion years 2000 to 2009 of the temporary foreign worker program in Canada, these were also the years where the Philippines was able to forge memoranda of understanding with Canadian provinces. So those happened between 2006 and 2008, and the most recent one was with the Yukon Territory in 2022. What is interesting about the MOUs that were forged with Canada were some very, what we would probably consider as some forward-looking provisions. One, there is specific mention about worker protection. There is also specific mention about the employer pays principle when it comes to recruitment-related costs. And finally, not all of the Canadian provinces have this, but in most MOUs, there are references to developing the human resources in the Philippines, which is very interesting. Okay? But the thing is, how has this really been enforced? Okay? So that is maybe one of our future assignments, to maybe go back to these MOUs, review the enforcement, and also have some indicators of what are the outcomes so that we can really know what has happened since. Okay? And I think the last two issues that I'd like to mention here is that there are challenges to labor migration governance because of immigration consultancies, which are not under the purview of the Department of Migrant Affairs. There's a lot of third country hiring that is going on. And in fact, in one of the interviews that we had with one of our resource persons, we think of third country like, for example, living from the Philippines to Hong Kong and from Hong Kong to Canada. Okay? But there are also instances where people are already in Canada, but because of conditions that they find, very challenging conditions that they find in Canada, they're thinking of moving to Australia. So yung third country hiring is not just from another foreign country to go to another country, but also actually it will already be fourth country hiring if that is also going to happen. And an indication that this particular issue is really challenging is the fact that I think in February, the Migrant Workers Office in Vancouver actually had a webinar concerning third country hiring and providing a lot of information to Filipinos in Canada, why this is not the way to go. And then there's also direct hiring outside of the DMW process. Okay? Maybe later when we have time we can go more into that. And really the mixed bag that social media and online platforms provide in terms of information. There's a lot of liberalization of information and information explosion, but then there's also a lot that needs to be, there's a lot of discernment that's also required to be able to distinguish the fake news from the real news and good information to other types of information. And lastly, maybe I would just like to go back and to flag this particular point that while temporary migration is indeed happening quite quickly in Canada, but then because of the pathway for residents that's being offered in Canada, at some point maybe there's also going to be a shift in how we approach the programs and services to overseas Filipinos in Canada. Maybe less so in terms of labor migration, but also more services and programs that are geared towards helping them integrate in Canada. So I think I just like to conclude. Thanks very much.
Okay, so I know this looks like like a lot of paper, and it is, but it's also a very large font. So hopefully that balances it out a little bit. I feel like recalibration is like the word of the day. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Canadian side of the equation, talking a little bit about a kind of sort of offering a few more details, I think, to the history that Marla provided, going a little further back as well, and then providing some sort of ethnographic example, which I'll be moving through from the research that we've done with a number of different cohorts of Filipino workers at Tim Hortons in Canada and also in Manila. And sort of central to this is a discussion and kind of consideration of both skill and of pathways to permanency. And so if we think about the contemporary moment, right, you know, there's of course a larger history of immigration to Canada that needs to be accounted for, but the sort of the kind of foundational example of both de-skilling and the transitioning of otherwise temporary foreign workers to permanent residency is, of course, the Live-In Caregiver Program. And so the Live-In Caregiver Program, as I'm sure all of you are very well familiar with, you know, originated in 1994 in its sort of, well, not its most contemporary iteration, but in that particular version. And effectively what we saw through the cohorts of women who came through the Live-In Caregiver Program was profound de-skilling. So you had physicians, you had nurses, you had midwives, you know, effectively becoming domestic workers in Canada, doing light cleaning and caregiving roles. But you also saw the establishment of a mechanism that would allow temporary workers to become permanent residents in Canada. And so over the lifespan of the Live-In Caregiver Program, you know, 95% of those women eventually became permanent residents. And you know, there was a Senate committee, and they really saw the Live-In Caregiver Program as the kind of as a moment of hope for what labor migration to Canada could look like. And I think that over the last sort of 50 years, 40 years, we've had these glimmers of hope in terms of what could a less exploitative labor migration sort of regime look like. And there have been these moments in Canada where it has felt quite possible. Unfortunately, and I think, you know, the changes were very well sort of reviewed by Marla, this is less the case right now. So in terms of the ability to transition to permanent residency, you know, that has become less and less the case since the changes have been implemented. So the caps, for example, on the provincial nominee numbers, you know, they've been slashed in half for many provinces that otherwise do a pretty decent job of protecting temporary foreign workers and transitioning them to permanent residency. Anyways, none of that was written down, so it's extra. But anyways, so this is sort of what I'm going to be talking about today, and I promise I'll skim through some of this. But with sort of all accounts of labor mobility into Canada, further complicating the scenario that was provided to us by Marla and Clarence is, of course, this near constant recalibration of Canadian immigration policy and the messy kind of compatibility of federal and provincial immigration schemes. And so that's kind of one of the key things here is that in Canada, migration historically has been managed federally, but constitutionally, the provinces are able to control their own immigration programs. And so that sort of happened in the late 1990s. So integral to the discussion that I'm going to be offering today are those interests of the state, so in this instance, both the federal and provincial government, which is revealed in the policies they enact, and the ways in which those interests sort of coincide with those of local employers and the larger scale enterprises that increasingly sort of dominate the operations of local Tim Hortons restaurants. So International Restaurant Brands International and 3G Capital. And so the local franchisees and the larger sort of multinational entity are oftentimes in conflict with one another, but all the same are sort of like, you know, marching to the beat of the same drum. Next slide. So more though than kind of just offering insight into the compatibility of state and capital, what we argue is that immigration policy in Canada sort of serves as a corrective to the tensions that, at least on the surface, plague the relationship between these different sort of levels of capital. Put differently, Canadian immigration policy sort of bolsters the resilience of capital in Canada and globally as it generates and sanctions conditions that are effectively conducive to exploitation. In turn, and in light of those conditions, migrants need to develop their own forms of resiliency and ways of making sense of the, at times, sort of false promises of Tim Hortons Canada and also of the sort of Canadian dream. Next slide. Oh, no, that first one, yeah. So for many temporary visa holders, of course, Tim Hortons is not just an opportunity for Canadian employment and earnings. Instead, over the last 15 years, the quick service restaurant has become well known in Canada and in the Philippines as a viable, until perhaps recently, consistent pathway to permanent residency. So the ability of otherwise initially temporary foreign workers to transition to permanent residency status is a unique feature of Canadian immigration policy and a legacy of the country's history as a settler colonial state, even as, you know, there is a tendency to attribute that to a more contemporary moment. So the opportunity and likelihood of permanent residency is an important one, both for migrants and their families, and as a kind of modest step, as I was rambling on about earlier, toward a more equitable and just immigration policy. So in addition to redressing many of the stressors of transnational family life, the ability to transition to permanent residency status dramatically undercuts many of the profoundly exploitative features of Canada's various guest worker programs. And so all of that is true, and as I said, there is a kind of hopefulness to it. And yet, as many scholars have highlighted, there are these tensions and contradictions that are embedded within this opportunity. So programs transitioning temporary workers and residents to permanent residency status are, in Canada, typically employer supported. In other words, migrants require a full-time permanent job offer to be eligible for permanent residency. This requirement tends to deepen rather than mitigate migrant worker dependency on their employers, and in turn, it duplicates many of the more problematic conditions of the TFWP. I think it's also important to sort of note here that a lot of employers actually do this very well. And so in supporting their workers, they are in a meaningful way redressing these sort of more exploitative tendencies. Other workers, and it tends to be a little like dependent on the province and the availability of workers, tend to be a little bit more controlling with this opportunity. And then the other sort of issue is that given labor market exclusions in Canada, and they are intense for newcomers, and in particular racialized newcomers, even when precarious residency is resolved, many now permanent residents remain relegated to low-wage labor markets. So you might arrive to Tim Hortons thinking that eventually you're going to pivot and do something else. That proves to be very, very difficult for many people. And so there's something about the ways in which immigration policy intersects with labor market stratification more generally, that labor migration, even when an individual worker transitions out of sort of the abject precarity of temporary residency, retains its exploitative features. So our work on the Tim Hortons corridor also kind of prompts us to consider how the policy mechanisms used to recruit and eventually retain migrant workers reflect and reinforce specific, often racialized forms of labor, through their reliance on these very reductive sort of assessments of skill. So consistently across our sample, which includes Filipino Tim Hortons workers in British Columbia, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia, we encountered persistent de-skilling. So these assessments and the ways in which skill has become kind of reified and codified through immigration policy have specific ramifications for the transnationally realized reproductive projects of migrant families, as well as for the reproductive projects of the state, as related to Canadian labor markets, political economy, and Canadian racial capitalism. In turn, and given the high prevalence of highly skilled Filipino labor in low-waged, low-skilled Canadian employment sectors, these assessments, but more kind of precisely, the misalignment of skilled category and actual skill have significant implications for Filipino subjectivity in Canada. In addition then to its function as a kind of labor migration corridor and pathway to permanent residency, Tim Hortons kind of emerges as a site dependent on and reproducing of the devaluation of Filipino skill in Canada. And so immigration policy, but more precisely Canada's immigration regime and its embeddedness within Canadian political economy kind of facilitates this. And in so doing, it generates inconsistencies, contradictions, and dependencies, again, even for those with permanent or soon-to-be permanent residency status, that are consistently advantageous to capital, often to the detriment of the workers. And there is, of course, a very large literature on de-skilling that has documented this pattern across receiving states and across migrant groups. But what kind of, the fan is like blowing the page. What emerges as kind of particularly insidious in the Canadian context, and I think that this is kind of important, is the extent to which multiculturalism and an ostensibly kind of liberalized immigration regime conceals this reality, right? So it naturalizes the otherwise sort of socially constituted identities of newly arrived Filipinos in the country. Next slide, let's see where we're at. Next. So this is the sort of, these are the origins, right, of the Canadian settler state. And state building and kind of capitalist expansion in Canada have always sort of worked in lockstep through the workings of immigration policy. And so it's beyond the scope of today to like go into all of this. But if we look at the development objectives and strategies of migration management in Canada over time, what's revealed is this deep collaboration between state and capital, such that immigration policy, right, often arbitrated by and for private actors, has long produced and reproduced the kind of particularities of Canadian political economy, and in turn the conditions of labor markets, as well as the sort of social positioning and construction of particular cohorts of labor, both temporary and permanent. And so by way of example, we can look to early campaigns recruiting white, British, and Western Europeans to Canada, and more specifically to the newly formed Western provinces, coupled with legislation that would manage temporary forms of labor recruitment. So for example, the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885, which was the first of many restrictive immigration policies that would preclude permanent immigration based on race, while ensuring that employers in labor markets deemed dirty, difficult, and dangerous still had access to workers. And then, you know, the establishment of kind of contemporary guest worker programs in Canada occurs, you know, a little under 100 years later, at a moment when immigration policy was otherwise sort of modified to omit race-based criteria and restrictions. So, commonly known as, we all know all of this, right? The point system. Canada's comprehensive ranking system was introduced in 1967, and so this is the 1966 white paper on immigration, and it asks Who specifically should be permanently admissible to Canada and who should not? The answers to this question must involve no discrimination of race, color, or religion, and consequently they must be universally applied. So no longer selected based on national origin or race. Immigrant applicants or migrant hopefuls, as of 1967 in Canada, would be assessed and scored across several categories: age, education, language ability, and occupational skills. So coupling immigration and skills while omitting explicitly biased race-based criteria, the point system was ideologically sort of more consistent with the country's nascent, institutionalizing multicultural identity. And it was intended to sort of level the playing field, making Canada more accessible to a larger number of people. So this is, of course, laudable in principle. However, what the move does is it reorients selection criteria to class-based privileges while continuing to reward those from Europe, as well as English and French speakers with a direct line to permanent residency and from their Canadian citizenship. 1 year prior to this, so 1 year prior to 1967 and the passing of the Immigration Act, which would, as I was saying, in principle, sort of subvert the white-only immigration preferences of Canadian immigration officials and bureaucrats, the country established the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. So this happens in 1966 as a government-to-government contract labor program between Canada and Jamaica. So since its founding, the SAWP has grown to include Mexico and other Caribbean countries. A key feature of this program is that workers arrive for a determined period, so no more than 8 months, to work in the agricultural sector during peak labor-intensive seasons, after which they return to their country's origin. And so the program is managed through a series of bilateral safety state agreements, such that only workers from specific countries, Mexico and the Caribbean, are eligible. So the near concurrent establishment of the 1966 SAWP and the 1967 Immigration Act, allowed Canada to sort of have its proverbial cake and eat it too. The country could lay claim to openness and inclusivity, even as permanent resettlement was largely restricted to those with high levels of social and monetary capital, distancing itself from its very strategic exclusionary immigration policy, of the past, all the while ensuring ongoing access to highly dependent, highly exploitable, often racialized labor. And so this dynamic or tension is kind of the oxygen of Canadian migration management. And it very much informs the experiences of our Tim Hortons bound and employed Filipino workers. I have my water. Thanks. Sorry. Sorry. So in this context, Tim Hortons has developed this unique reputation as a known kind of gateway to Canada. And I think importantly, as an employer willing to support and facilitate permanent residency for otherwise temporary workers. It's also an important site of kind of newcomer worker socialization. And so what I will kind of talk through now is sorry about that. So in terms of the project, what I'll do now is kind of turn to these different cohorts of workers who have come from the Philippines to work at Tim Hortons. And so these are the sort of 5 cohorts that we have interviewed. So Filipinos in Manila who work at Tim Hortons and who are interested in, but not currently pursuing, overseas employment. Migrant hopefuls in the Philippines who have interviewed for work at Tim Hortons and are waiting for a job offer. Migrants in waiting who have received a job offer with Tim Hortons and are soon departing the Philippines. Filipino temporary foreign workers employed in Canada at Tim Hortons,
And then finally, other temporary Canadian residents who have sought out Tim Hortons employment as a means of redressing their temporary status as either international students or as the spouses of international students, and are hoping to use their time at Tim Hortons as a way of transitioning to permanent residency. So this is actually research that I conducted during my PhD, and so it was captured in those cohorts of migrants that we spoke to. But this is an important group of workers, and it is because these are amongst the first to arrive in Canada, in Manitoba, through the newly expanded temporary foreign worker program that included a growing number of sectors, including service and hospitality, and who, because of this amazing moment in the Manitoba Provincial Nominee Program, were all able to transition to permanent residency. And so what we have here is this example of a small town in rural Manitoba be profoundly revived by the presence of initially 72 young Filipino workers who over time would, can you go to the next slide? Sorry. Who over time would facilitate the arrival of nearly 200 friends, family, co-workers, people they had worked with all throughout the Philippines. And the hotel, through its very strategic use of the provincial nominee program, was able to recruit within the networks of these workers, circumventing, I think, some of what Marla was talking about in terms of the oversight otherwise provided in the Philippines. So the next slide here is sort of meant to represent those workers who were less fortunate in their attempts to transition. Oh no, can you go back to that first one? To their first, this image is meant to sort of represent, again, as I was saying, those workers who were less fortunate in transitioning to permanent residency. And so this is a Tim Hortons in Alberta, where temporary foreign workers, at least in our experience, have it's more of a lottery, right? In Manitoba, where there are fewer folks, it's quite common for people to transition to permanent residency. In Alberta, where the numbers, because of the resource extraction industry, are much, much higher, the ability to transition to permanent residency is reserved for one or two workers at each Tim Hortons. And so there you see the kind of reinforcement of the exploitative kind of patterns or possibilities of the temporary foreign worker program being duplicated through the provincial nominee programs and the ways in which employers are able to sort of use it, right, as a carrot, effectively. So you demonstrate to me your willingness to be loyal and to work hard, and I will reward you with a promotion or with a nomination or my support of your nomination. And so here we encountered several workers who returned to the Philippines, having acquired a sort of particular kind of skill set at the Tim Hortons locations that they worked at in Canada. In the context of the Philippines, they were able to sort of translate that into supervisory or managerial sorts of positions, but all the same, right, they were still sort of front of house workers, and given the sort of wage discrepancies between Canada and the Philippines, right, they experienced a considerable sort of decrease in their earnings by virtue of this. And here, the strategy is to sort of hold tight and to wait to see if another opportunity in Canada presents itself. So this is can you go to the next one? Right. So the third cohort are those currently in the Philippines and who are employed at Tim Hortons. And the folks that we spoke to here very much saw their employment as a kind of stepping stone to employment and eventually residency in Canada. So here it's sort of obscured so that they're not
visible. But these sort of young, ambitious, well-educated people anticipated that the kind of Canadian experience that they acquired at Tim Hortons Philippines would eventually sort of facilitate access to Canadian labor markets, and more specifically to employment at Tim Hortons Canada. And we managed to, I don't think they're going to let us in again, but we managed to get into Tim Hortons, like the head office here. And this was several years ago now, but they had an attrition rate of 25%. 25% of their workers left and stated that the reason for doing so was that they had secured employment in Canada. So it was, very much sort of seen as a pathway. Can you go to the one ahead, not the other one? Yeah, perfect. So the fourth cohort, we met them as they were about to depart from the Philippines for British Columbia, and this was February of last year. And these workers were all, of course, very eager to start their journeys. They spoke, as many do, about supporting family, ensuring well-being, working hard, but enjoying the benefits of life in Canada. Like a growing number of temporary foreign workers leaving to work at Tim Hortons in Canada, these young people were sort of selected according to two sets of requirements. The first, enabling them to work at Tim Hortons, and the second, ensuring that they would be able to transition to permanent residency if their employer would support their applications. And so I met up with them again in BC July of last year. The cost of living, which of course comes out of nowhere for people, they are, at least again in my experience, profoundly unaware of what it is going to cost to survive in Canada. So the cost of living, coupled with a reduction in their hours, which wasn't legal, meant that most of their aspirations, held sort of so hopefully earlier that year, felt utterly unattainable as of July. And yet, of course, they continued on. So one worker reported their conditions to a recruiter in the Philippines to no avail. She works now, hours reduced, but kind of forging onward all the same. The other unexpected thing is healthcare. So in Canada, of course, healthcare, don't worry, I'm not gonna, I swear, I will not do this. But healthcare also sort of emerges as a significant cost and barrier that or not a cost, because of course it's public healthcare, but most workers that I talk to speak about wanting to access Canadian healthcare, and that this is something that they really are holding out for. And of course, given the conditions of Canadian healthcare, that never materializes. And so you have, medical needs that go unmet because the workers can't access doctors the way they once were able to in the Philippines. The other sort of, I'll skip ahead to, and the other thing I won't do is, I won't go to this. I won't go into the NOC classification. I've been writing a paper and it's been all about the NOC. And so when I first sat down to write this, I was like, oh, everybody's going to want to know what NOC they are. And that is definitely not the case. I'm sure of it. But I think what happens a little bit, one of the sort of problems that emerges for folks is, depending on your point of entry, your program of entry, your NOC classification is calculated differently. And so I have a close friend and colleague who is also a participant in this research, and upon her arrival in Canada, she and I had the same NOC designation, right? That of a university professor with an advanced degree. In Canada, however, her NOC is that of a Tim Hortons barista. And so, I of course don't want to sort of lean into, oh my goodness, PhD working at Tim Hortons, what a tragedy, right? Working at Tim Hortons is valuable, important, meaningful work for a number of reasons. But there is a kind of, I have it written down somewhere. but there is an injury that happens, I think, for people when they are unable to practice their professions, when they are unable to realize the skills that they have in a context that selects them on the basis of those skills. And so it's that kind of incompatibility and that inconsistency that I think people find so disheartening, so discouraging, and they experience it, and I think rightfully so, as a betrayal. You know, Canada consistently says that we are in the market for the best and the brightest. The best and the brightest come to Canada, and they are not able to realize their potential. And so, in that sense, and I think thinking about these recalibrations, they recalibrate the policy, but it is on balance consistent, right? I mean, this has consistently been the objective of the Canadian state, working again in lockstep with sort of big financial interests. So I said I wasn't going to read this, and I didn't, most of it. So I'm gonna end it there and turn it over to all of you for discussion. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Kat. And I think without further ado, I would just like to open the floor for comments and questions.
So can we invite our panel to take a seat in front so they could receive questions from the audience? Does anyone want to raise a question for any member of our panel?
UP Diliman and also with Asian and Pacific Migration Program. I actually have 6 points here listed, pero in the interest of time, I'll just maybe reduce it to 2. First point, it's minor, but I mean, to me, it's important because importance has been packaged as the quintessential Canadian enterprise. But I find it strange that its biggest selling product has come from Canada. So I wonder if that can also be integrated, into your study. Second is in '74 when we had the Overseas Employment Program, Marla talks about this. But prior to that, migration was not seen as a subject of state intervention or even state policy. Migration was seen more of a personal decision on the part of the person moving. And I think that also should be put into context here, especially when it comes to immigrants coming from the Philippines, in Canada, or even the United States. Yeah, those are just the 2 points. Others not points.
Does anyone from the panel want to respond to or not?
Well, just quickly about the sort of like the supply chain, and I think that that's a very sort of interesting and important question, and it's work. So it's work that I've kind of done in a separate sort of, not in relation to importance, but in relation to sort of the food localization movement in Nova Scotia and its reliance on migrant workers, seasonal agricultural workers in particular. And so in Canada, this whole sort of thing about Tim Hortons as being Canada's coffee chain, in a way, it's like the most essentially Canadian feature of that is its integration of temporary foreign workers into its operations. But of course, it's like where the coffee comes from. All of those things are also kind of important features of all of this. And it's kind of funny. Well, I don't know if it's funny. It's hugely wasteful. But the donuts that are, the donuts, they're just made in this factory in Ontario, and then they're distributed all over the world, right? So it's all very odd, and yeah, yeah. And anyway, sorry, I am a little pretty bit jet lagged, so please forgive me for just trailing off donuts. But yeah, no, it is an important question about where these things come from, where they're made.
Thanks for the study. It is really very interesting. And I was one of the provinces, one province taking advantage of the change in policy and things like that. This is a trend now that is beginning to be seen in other corridors as well. So, for example, you've got the South Korean corridor of seasonal workers. I'm wondering whether this is how you problematize this as both in country of origin as well as country of destination, that migration has an impetus of its own kind of thing, and local governments are going to circumvent when national government want to regulate. So for the Philippines, we are seeing that, for example, in a number of corridors at the moment. So how does policy making then take into consideration this, and that migration is actually challenging this nation-state kind of concept, and we are going into smaller kind of configurations of this. So that is the first question. The second question is this waiting period. How intergenerational that is, because I would see it as very normal that somebody is going, because this happens with other nationalities as well, because the idea is not that I am going. The idea is I'll get there and maybe my future, my children will have a better pathway kind of thing. So it's not really for me. So that kind of culture-wise, where you have a Western culture which is very individual and centric on the self, there is this other culture that comes in that plays a waiting game for another generation kind of thing. So how does this configure into the study? How deep would it go in its analysis?
The policy question, I think that, the part of the way that Canada sort of exerts this control over immigration, of course, is to do it kind of, not secretly, but these changes happen, people aren't really made aware of them, they sort of seemingly happen from one minute to the next. And the federal government, despite the provincial and territorial governments being empowered to implement and develop their own immigration programs, the federal government continues to have the kind of final say. And so, in many ways, unless the flexibility is afforded to them by the federal government, the provinces remain quite sort of beholden to, for example, the caps that the federal government implements. And that oftentimes corresponds to a political climate that exists federally that doesn't necessarily exist provincially. And so there is a lot of tension, I think, between the federal and the provincial governments. And, for a while it was always about sort of the provinces arguing for greater numbers of nominations that they could issue or give out. And then, more recently, it's in response to these changes. But the federal government, recently has sort of done this kind of fairly sneaky thing where they haven't blamed, the housing crisis on immigrants, but they've sort of suggested that under the current conditions, Canada is no longer able to meet the needs of a growing population. And so until such a time that those needs can be met and that people can be, integrated into labor markets in meaningful ways, they're going to curb the numbers. The provinces don't see it that way at all. And then I think in terms of the sort of the generational sort of reproduction of all of this, the people that we have interviewed, and certainly the people, the sort of 71 people who were in my PhD research, they belonged to long-standing migrant families. But what was interesting is that it was less about the sort of opportunities for education or upward mobility in the Philippines, and it really became focused on that pathway to permanency. That became the thing that a mother would pass on to her child. It was permanent residency. And there's one participant from my PhD work, and she was just incredible. And she came from this family. Her husband's family, they were all in California. Her brother was in Chicago. They were all physicians. They were all working as nurses in the States. And she was the recipient of their remittances. And she had 3 children, and they all went to private school, and she didn't work. And she was vilified by her family, right? I mean, I visited them, and they did not go back. And she orchestrated this permanent relocation to Canada and just dramatically redirected her own or sort of repositioned herself within her family. And so she became a hotel housekeeper. She didn't need to, she didn't need the money, but it was about sort of fulfilling these expectations in a sense, but also kind of proving to herself and to her family that she could do it. And she, her husband came, her children came, she got them all jobs, they're all Canadian citizens now. And so that, over the kind of 15 years that I've been doing this, like that is the objective, right? It's securing permanency in a different way.
So, other questions, reactions?
I'll just give a quick comment on migration and waiting, and what I thought is really something that migration scholars should be thinking about, which is the phenomenon of waithood. That there's something about waiting and the phenomenon of waithood that needs to be included in understanding the migration process, because it doesn't include only the migrant, but rather the aspiration of the migrant for the collective, for the community. And I'm happy that we're starting to see it. And that is the same way why I was very much interested in looking into the lives of the standbys in the Philippines, because the stereotype for those people who are just criminalized standbys, they all thought that they are just a waste of society. And then when you start to look into their lives, you know that they are not just simply standing by. They are waiting for a purpose. And one of the interesting things about the study I did with the standbys is that they are probably seen as non-transitioning, but they are fighting out in many ways how to navigate and negotiate lives. But being part of this team made me realize that there are really those standbys who are not looking to transition within the country, but rather they want to fly out of the country. They are fed up with this country because they cannot find good jobs, especially those who have invested money in education. And primarily, I was just so happy listening and reading to the reports of the Education Commission 2, which simply admitted
the failure of our educational system in this country because of the miseducation. And it's the researchers, it's the Congress, it's the Philippine government admitting this. And in my view, this is really dangerous for this country. And that one of the interesting expression of it is that we have different forms of standing by in this country. And the most dangerous, I suppose, are those educated ones who are always wanting, hoping for some kind of reversal of their status, because you cannot find easy job, easily here in the country, and that's very true. And the sad thing is, for those Tim Hortons that we evaluated, the video clips, the TikTok, and the film, it reflects the next level of marginalization that they experience. We see that they are of gratitude, but we also note about those unexpressed TikTok messages about brain drain, a manager in the Philippines and being a Tim Hortons regular baker. There's some injury. I love that metaphor. The injuries. And I do not know to what extent can we really fully document the injuries that these migration processes impact, the growing up process of these young professionals. We have, I was, as a youth sociologist, I was really so interested in this study because the migrants that we're talking about are young, right? And these are the hope of this country, going out of this country and hoping that they get to have the entire family relocate in the country of destinations. I just find that this narrative is socially reproduced, not only in this generation, but I think in the last 60 years now in this country.
Perhaps also to add to that, because when we have this concept of waiting, it seems that it's kind of passive, but actually it can also involve a lot of action plan. And this is coming from another study that we did, but with the purpose also, we interviewed workers who were already in Canada, but previous to that, they were working in countries like Singapore and Hong Kong. Okay? And in a way, it also gave support to the work of Andrew Paul on her work on multinational maids, wherein there's this idea that the primary destination is somewhere else, like maybe a country like Canada, because again, there's this promise of pathway to permanent residence and the possibility to bring your family members with you, not just working by yourself in the destination country. But the interviews that we have done with Filipinos who were able to successfully migrate to Canada and work there, but previously coming from places like Hong Kong, they were also very strategic, because like they know that they wanted to go to Canada, but then they see Hong Kong as a stepping stone, and so when they found work in Hong Kong as a domestic worker, she said that she did not just choose any employer that came up, but she purposely chose to work in a household where she would take care of young children or take care of a family member who needs special attention or an elderly person, because she was aware that this is the kind of experience that would land her employment as a live-in caregiver in Canada. So while waiting for the chance to go to Canada, she worked in Hong Kong for a while, but with the idea that she has to be strategic in finding an employer that would build experience in child care, in elderly care, that would improve her chances to go to Canada. But also one thing that I'd like to mention, Clarence, about the disappointment of our young people that they have finished an education, and that's always something that our parents would say. Basta magtapos ka lang, no? You can do anything after you have completed your college education, okay? Have a boyfriend later, but first you must finish, no? And then finding out that they could not find work in the Philippines, I think that is also a situation that's quite common across different countries, where youth unemployment is actually a lot higher for those who have completed college education compared to those without. So that is indeed a challenge that our country has to attend to, because otherwise we run the risk of ending up with a generation of disenchanted young people in this country.
Yeah, just do a follow-up. As a follow-up, then I'm wondering, because look, on the one hand, the research does bring out concepts that are standby, waiting, injury. I think these are fantastic concepts to see the resilience of people. How the patience, the resilience, the desire to show. So you have that playing out in the communities among people. And then on the other hand, you have the state with its governance policies kind of thing. Very myopic in terms of a transaction that it does through bilateral agreements and things like that, facilitating movement in what is seen sometimes as the gold standard of migration governance, or even if you say ethical recruitment and things like that, and then you see de-skilling and things like that. So isn't it a farce kind of thing that the regulation does not take into account this aspect of the standby, the resilience, the waiting, the de-skilling, that is, which should inform policy, right? But it doesn't. So we are in a migration phase at the moment kind of thing, globally, I think, where states get into these kind of transactions to facilitate without taking into consideration what's happening with communities, with societies, with people. How do you see this then as within the framework of this bigger frames of achieving SDGs, addressing poverty, this kind of big frames that also the state is engaged in, because there is at a certain level a huge amount of injustice, I would say, being done at the community level kind of thing, which migration in some way becomes symptomatic of kind of thing. And Philippines, I think, is very much in that space, as a country that is so heavily dependent on deployment.
I think that, Canadian immigration policy, on the one hand, doesn't appear to take into account the ways in which labor markets are actually stratified and organized in Canada, according to, racist tropes and histories. But then simultaneously, it, reinforces and reproduces and seemingly kind of depends on the existence of those sort of stratified labor markets. And in Canada, there's of course no end to legislation that is intended to safeguard against discrimination, against violations of people's rights. But the one sort of area where that sort of remains a little bit, it's around the sort of legal status, right? So the piece around legal status seems to give license still to employers to, engage in some fairly problematic ways. And again, it's like, we've done work with really excellent employers. And people in the agricultural sector, people in service and hospitality, people in fish processing, sectors that have bad reputations, there are good actors within those sectors. But it is still permitted, right? So long as people are bound to close work permits, so long as they are dependent on their employer. And I think, and now I'm moving away from the question, and I'll just do it quickly. I do think that on the ground there's actually more flexibility to, for example, change employers, right? So migrant rights activists rightfully kind of lament the closed permit system, but it's not uncommon for workers to switch employers, either through the assistance of a recruiter or through the assistance of an employer. So, for example, I was doing work in fish processing plants, interviewing Filipino temporary foreign workers who had arrived mostly from Taiwan. They had all worked in electronics manufacturing and had moved to Canada to eventually transition to permanent residency. Their employer was only able to provide them with a seasonal job, which would preclude them from transitioning to permanent residency. And that employer, worked within his networks to secure employment for those workers that would allow them to transition through the Atlantic Immigration Program. So, I think as much as we kind of focus on, and now I'm totally away from the question, but as much as we focus on the sort of actions of bad players, there does need to be a focus on those governments, those entities, and those employers who are not kind of operating accordingly. And we need to sort of figure out, what they're doing, and we need to figure out the ways in which, again, like, and even still within government, there are people in government who are well aware of the realities on the ground in terms of, labor markets. It's just a question of how to operationalize that differently in the policy. And I don't know, we'll see what happens after this horrifying election that we're entering into.
Thank you. I like the premise of the question about the disconnect between our research and the state policies. And I really think, and I'm biased here because I am a teacher of research and a researcher. See, there are only 188 researchers in the Philippines for every million, according to the report of the Education Commission 2. Only 188 per million are researchers in this country. And so what do you expect? The disconnect is expected. I do not know to what extent can we dialogue these insights with the Department of Employment Work. Right? So maybe it's really very important to prioritize and even question the many theses being thought out, written in our universities and colleges. Para saan yun? Sino gumagamit nun? Is it just really a waste of exercise? Because I really see that that is where the problem is. We do not connect. We do not relate. I think we know enough, but we do not communicate all these insights in order for it to appeal for a macro level, change or analysis. And that is a sad truth that I have been telling my students. If I am teaching you research, then what is it for? I hope it will not be just for the purposes of discussions like this. I hope that it could land into something or somewhere. So I guess funds do matter. How much do this government allocate for research? And that is the sad truth that we have very, very minimal allocation for research for each department. Is the research department of that department the most important? I do not know. But I think it should be at least one of the most important units of the department, because that should be the source of insights and ideas for policy purposes.
In Canada, we seem to have nothing but researchers. Like it's there's and still, I mean,
There's a problem.
we're not taken overly serious, So I mean, and when changes do happen, it tends to be sort of one step forward, two steps back, like with the changes to the caregiver program. And so I think it's there's something else happening there here.
I don't know, my general observations and this concerns actually destination countries is that there's just a lot of premium on the more skilled. But actually, it's not just the more skilled workers that are needed, but also workers of different skill levels. The thing about distinguishing between the less skilled and the more skilled, really has to do with wages. Because the work that people in the less skilled sectors are doing, they're simply low-wage workers. But there's skills that are also involved in performing those types of work. But somehow, migration policies, particularly those that have to do with labor-related migration policies, make a distinction. And then when it comes to low-wage work, then low-wage work is the work that migrants do. Somehow, that has that stigma, that association has not really been dissociated. So we're talking about low-wage work, which is not necessarily less skilled. It's just an excuse, I guess, to say that, okay, we pay the less. And it's the word that, unfortunately, is the word that is often turned over to the effort.
And these are often sectors, of course, that see huge profits, right? I mean, groceries, and, just enormous profits. I had something to say there that I cannot recall.
I remember something about Canada.
Yes.
Seasonal.
Yeah.
Because Canada's seasonal program is actually held up as an example and was used as the model for New Zealand's as well as Australia's seasonal agricultural workers program. But, I was also quite mystified because Canada accepts agricultural workers, like those working in piggeries, etc. And there's somehow a pathway for residence for some of these workers. But for the seasonal agricultural workers, and these are workers coming sent from Mexico and the Caribbean, they work 8 months in a year in Canada, but there is definitely no pathway for residence for them. So why is it that we have to make a distinction between seasonal and also other agricultural workers? So there's something there that that's not quite connect.
I think in part it could be, so the work we did with the seasonal agricultural workers, I think it's those bilateral agreements, right? There's a requirement that they return. I mean, they arrive in Canada with their tickets already booked, and I think it might have to do with sort of like sustaining livelihood projects in Mexico or in Jamaica. But during the pandemic, a number of the provinces in the Atlantic region were in conversation about what would it look like to transition seasonal agricultural workers to permanent residency. But that, as far as I know, it never went anywhere. And it might have also been a secret.
All right. Thank you so much to Dr. Clarence, Dr. Catherine, and Dr. Marla for a very for answering questions and responding to our audience's reactions as well to the presentations. So I guess let us formally close the event so that we can also have our merienda already and for further exchanges after. Maybe we could hear from Dr. George for a brief closing remarks and synthesis of today's event.
Okay, thank you, Eunice. I will make this brief. I think I'm the only one giving you from your merienda, from our merienda. But my main takeaway here is how the world has been increasingly defined, reconstructed in terms of corridors, pathways to migration highways. In the case of Philippines and Canada, you might say it's a super highway of sorts. And each road that we see, defining the world around us today in terms of corridors, offers its own journey, its own adventure, its own challenges, and even dangers. What we also see here is how these migration corridors also provide some kind of direction for people, for individuals, and for households. I looked it up, and as far as importance is concerned, the region with the most branches outside Canada and the US is actually in the Middle East.
And so it's not a surprise to find, that connection between migration and Tim Hortons. So you may be onto something there. Finally, I want to thank Catherine, Clarence, of course Marla, and virtually also Dr. Pauline Barber for their presentations, and also to the people here who have decided to show up despite the heat in this at this time, to our guests from the private sector, from academe, from government, and also from the advocates. Maraming salamat po sa ating lahat.
Thanks so much, Dr. Tigna. Also, Dr. Tigna is currently the editor of the Asian Pacific Migration Journal, or APMG. So, and I think that concludes our session for this afternoon. So, thank you so much for everyone's participation and attendance in today's forum.